at ya, bad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, bad at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. We are joined with Christy Kelly here again from India. She's got the call center look going on again. She may have to dip out of the conversation sometime to fix a customer service issue, but other than that, it's good to have her. And I guess this week is Jeremy Carl, senior fellow at Claremont Institute, former deputy assistant secretary of Interior under Trump, and the author of a new book, The Unprotected Class, all about the BLM and the importance of the uplift of the black. Oh no, that's wrong. I'm sorry. It's how anti-white racism, how anti-white racism.
That was my negative world book that I read.
Is tearing America apart. Jeremy, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, I guess we have to start, whenever you write a book, it's something that had to drive people to write it. So why you wrote the book, but also, did you feel like you needed some level of courage in order to do it? It seemed like it's a stark turn from everything else that's out there.
Yeah, well, I was too dumb not to is probably the most honest answer. And, I think one of the things that I really did have is for a long time, I felt like this book needed to be written. And it was a little bit like the story of Jonah, and God tells him to go to Nineveh, and he sort of, says, no, I don't really want to do that. And then, the fish swallows him up, he gets spit back up, and God says that, you really need to go to Nineveh. And finally I was like, okay, I guess I need to, because I felt it was a really important issue. I felt like I could do justice to it. And even though for all the reasons that you could imagine, just in terms of the hassle, the controversy, I didn't want to write this book. I wanted somebody else to write the bok. It wasn't getting written. So I felt like I could do it well. And so I just needed to kind of take it up and do it. And that's sort of why I decided to do it.
In a rare direct turn to the co-hosts here, I'm going to ask them a really clean, direct question for both Will and Christy. Is there anti-white racism?
I mean, I can go first if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, of course. So I think that when I wrote my first book, Hate Crime Hoax, I talked to one of the guys, I think it was Tom Spence at Regnery, and he said the best books in general are those that make kind of an almost obvious point that's been out there, but that for some reason hasn't been expressed. I mean, I think Jeremy in an interview referred to this as picking money up off the ground. For example, I was talking about the fact that most of these high profile hate crime incidents were fakes, like Jussie Smollett, Yasmin Saweetie. Everyone on the right kind of knew that. There were websites like fakehatecrimes.org that had, I mean, our list is more comprehensive, but that had hundreds of them. That's a good project. And I just sort of said this. And after they got over, like, are we gonna deal with controversy for like this random, business guy who hasn't written anything before? Are we gonna do that? The idea was that the book would sell well and people would be receptive to it. It's kind of the same thing here. Like, well, of course there's anti-white racism. I mean, and I think there's anti-black racism too, which I don't think Jeremy denies.
Of course.
There are list experiments that show, like, if you apply for a blue collar job as a black man, you're slightly less likely to be hired, all that. But the flip side of that picture, which has been painted 100 times, is that if you are a Caucasian male and you apply to an Ivy or Big Ten university, there's going to be usually about 170 point hit put on your tests. I mean, there are entire other fields, jobs, policing, fire service, post office, where it's almost certainly a disadvantage in most cities to be Caucasian. And you also, I mean, like, everybody does this. I mean, we talk about like the internet culture we were discussing a little bit offline. It's not a minority or white specific thing, but certainly if you log onto Twitter, you'll see there's an account called Whites Taking L's, and there's an account called Blacks Taking L's, and Whites Taking L's tends to get, maybe censored or banned a little less. So it's just, yes, of course that's out there. And if someone just says, well, I think that it's extremely racist that you can write an article called The Real Problem with This Country is White Men, I mean, there's obviously going to be a pretty large number of people that are receptive to that. So yeah, there's anti-white bias, racism, whatever the technical term would be.
Well, I got to say, I mean, I'm sure we would get to this at some point, but since you mentioned it, I got to go there now. So what you're saying, a really important point you're making is that there's definitely anti-white racism. There's definitely anti-black racism. The issue, and a lot of time on Twitter, you get into these spaces, you do polls and people attack you, and you're really good at that about people trying to compare the difference of the volume of it. Yeah, the people that say, would post pictures of blacks doing some, punching people, getting in fights, and they'll say this is bad. And there's white people who'll say this is just in their nature, and then people can get upset. And then someone will find pictures of white people fighting and say, and kind of mockingly say stuff like, where are their fathers and that kind of thing. But it's not, that's all Twitter banner and it's funny, but that's not the issue. The issue really, what I get from what you're saying is that you can write about one and you can't write about the other, or one is covered so much more than the other. So even where they're both bad and they both have an effect, it's a different thing when you can when there's 47 books in 1 year on this topic in one direction, and his is the first one in like 3 years in the other direction. Or if you do that, they'll shadow ban or things of that nature. Isn't that the difference?
It's a quick commentary on that before Christy kind of gives her point. Like, I actually just Googled the problem with this country is white men, which is something I did once for an earlier book. And I mean, it's literally just articles with that headline, like CNN, there's nothing more frightening today than an angry white man. That's the real problem. Foreign policy focus, the problem of surplus white men. Amazon.com, angry white men, American masculinity at the end of an era. Duke School of Medicine, how to explain white privilege to a broke white person. USA Today, Don Lemon stands by claim white men are the biggest terrorists in the world. Last one, but race, masculinity, politics, and America's angry white men. So I don't necessarily think that one group is more racist than another if you go around the world. Or globally, whites probably are a little less racist, if anything, but everyone, engages in this kind of online talk. But I do think the crazy thing in America is that this is entirely unidirectional. Like, you see back and forth on Twitter and Facebook, but if I were to try to write an article called "There's Nothing More Frightening in America Today Than a Poor Black Man," I mean, there would be like people would be marching outside my office. There has been a very complete shutdown on the flip side of this. So you have an endless series of articles looking at where there's anti-black racism, and some of them find it, like a third of them or more find it. But there are no articles in the other direction, looking at racism against whites, Asians, sexism against men, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think that's a pretty significant omission, whichever one you think is bigger in the end.
I don't even think the Klan today, if they have a magazine, would run that article that you read. They'd be like, this is a little.
I'm pretty sure the Klan would.
They'd be like, this is too much for me. I don't think I can run that article.
I'm pretty sure if you go on Stormfront or something, you could see even like American Renaissance, you could see like blacks, America's problem. But like the thing is that is a niche sector of conversation. Whereas like the place that ran the article, America's biggest problem is white male terrorists, was CNN.
Or even
it was
better,
page in 2021.
Our current somewhat sitting president said it. So, I mean,
our biggest problem is white supremacy.
Thank you for reminding me.
Right, so even he could say that.
Just say before we let our third host here jump in, Wilfred, Tom Spence actually bought this book for Regnery, so I think you're very much right. This is probably his thinking, and
probably.
I would just also reiterate, because if I were like some brilliant theorist who wrote The Being of Isness or something, if I'm capable of writing some great philosophical work, I wouldn't have written on this. But as you said, it was just like, oh, here's a $20 bill lying on the ground, and all you need to do is have a little courage to pick it up, and that some people are going to call me a thief because I picked it up, and so I was like, well, that's kind of how I came to write the book.
Right. And so Christy, I'd ask you the same question. Is there anti-white racism? And then of course you can opine about your controversial topics that you've written. I'm assuming everyone else on the panel has written some. I got race crazy, so I'm out there too. So you can talk about how your publisher was afraid to publish your book. Go on.
No, I definitely think that it's been kind of like a long-standing thing about white privilege and the white supremacy. And so at some point we felt the need to balance that. And in trying to balance that, there was definitely an overcorrection. Now, we can definitely point to George Floyd, but I know it happened way before that, because I even remember when I was an undergrad, there was like the rise of like the Women's Center to like, fight the white privilege and to fight the, white supremacy and the feminists. And then there was like the Black Center was, the big thing. And this is at, at white universities. Now, I will say, to even utter white pride, that there is a backlash. I mean, white people cannot utter white pride, or, I was in the South for 5 years. They can't be proud of their heritage, even if that heritage, or especially if that heritage was, based at any point, in the Civil War. So I definitely think there is an overcorrection. I just don't know where that happy medium is. And I think that at least in your talks that you've given, I think sometimes it may swing a little, like I'll be with you, and then it just swings a little far for me.
That's fine. And I mean, I think one of the interesting things that you mentioned in trying to find that balance and where that balance really lies is that, we absolutely had white supremacy and white privilege in this country. And when we did, nobody talked about white supremacy and white privilege because you actually were under a white supremacist regime. So, at that time, you're not gonna, it's the water you're swimming in. And because there would be white supremacy out there, you're not going to go challenge that without being very careful. You go back, it just depends, I guess, on how far back you want to draw it. But certainly a century or more ago, you would have had it quite clearly. And it's only now where we really see kind of the pendulum swinging very much the other way that that people do talk about white privilege and white supremacy. And I argue in the book, it's not a coincidence that, in fact, the entire concept of white privilege, which came from a scholar named McIntosh, appears at Wellesley in the 1980s. That's kind of where it begins, or maybe Wesley, and I can never remember which, but the point is, it's like right at the point that this is really kind of dying, I would argue, as a phenomenon overall. That's when academia starts running with it.
Oh, right. Okay. You just mentioned that you made a point in the book, and I thought about that too. And I do like that because you don't hear that often, where you say, if it was really whites, or the inverse of what you said there, which is the same thing, but in the book you wrote it in a way that it was like, if the country today, because you said there was white supremacy in the past, but if the country today were white supremacists and there was white privilege and there was this, this powerful source of whiteness that was controlling everything, you probably wouldn't be able to say the things that you said. You wouldn't be able to write those books, right? It would be like being in North Korea and just walking down the street and spending your whole time talking about how bad the Kims are, right? How long will that last you?
Absolutely.
So that very fact proves that the society is not as racist as you claim it is, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Will, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll comment on that. I mean, I think that there's a general point there that I haven't really heard explored a lot, even in political science, but I think it's fascinating, which is that taboos, by definition, reflect what's non-dominant, like what's not the leading factorial in a society. So, like when you said, like the way I would put that in a kind of a wonkier way, like in North Korea, there aren't a lot of people walking around criticizing, one family Asian male dictatorship or something like that. I think I said this in a positive review of the book, actually. But I mean, so it's just like when we're talking constantly about the problems with white people, or even, I don't even think it's that when you get into normal conversations with a Black dude or a feminist. It's kind of the reverse. Like we're talking constantly about issues in the Black community, with immigrants, with women to some extent. And the assumption is kind of a Marxist assumption, right? It's that this is caused by external oppression. So it's not the case that women are a little smarter verbally, but much smaller than men and prefer different jobs. It's the case that men are keeping women from the ranks of Air Force wing commanders. And it's much more serious with Blacks, where it's the idea is that almost everything is due to the past. The 1619 Project is like, the sugar mills of the slave era are responsible for our diet today and so on. And when you respond to that, because I debate formally, and you're like, well, Hispanics actually eat the most sugar. Whites and Blacks are both actually pretty athletic. Well, the impact of it's just complete nonsense. But it's very, very influential.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that indicates that yes, we are not at least at the upper middle class, you don't want to say among people that matter, but we're not a white supremacist society. The desperate attempt to rid ourselves of that, it's almost like the Christian question of, how do you know you have a soul and want to get right with God? You worry about having a soul and want to get right with God. Like, if you're a genuinely evil person, you're not going to spend a lot of time worrying about this. So no, I think that's correct. Last quick point. I think that's true about a lot of things also. I mean, so when we say that like this society is very heterosexist and there's a taboo against sexual expression, I mean, I'm an adult, healthy male, and every time I log onto social media, I see naked people. I wanted to stop. Like, I don't think that we actually have a taboo against sexuality or a problem with gay. It's that reflects something in the past that we're embarrassed by, and overcompensating is a good simple word for what we're doing now.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, you kind of touched on this, with this sugar example. My favorite one, which I mentioned in the book, I think, is a lot of things where they say, Black fatherlessness today is a result of slavery. Whereas if you go back to 1940, right, when African-American social conditions were much, much worse, their economic conditions were much, much worse, and 90% of African-American children were born within a two-parent marriage, right?
But they didn't know about slavery back then, Jeremy. They didn't find out until the internet.
I guess not, right?
The internet.
They should have never told us then. I mean, but no, yeah, it was Walter. It was a little under 90. It was like Walter Williams said it was 11 to 12% illegitimacy or out of wedlock, whatever you prefer for blacks. Like whites were even better, like 4%. So all of this happened relatively recently.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan issues this kind of famous thing in the 1960s about the crisis in the black family, the illegitimacy rate in the black community at that time 24%. Was lower than the white illegitimacy rate is today.
It was 24%. Right?
So we've just got an entire social inversion. Yeah. So I mean, but the problem is you're often you go up against these just so stories, right? And those just so stories have incredible power in our media and in our culture. And so it's really difficult to kind of go against them sometimes.
Hey, Christy, is the biggest problem not so much that people feel this way, because you're always going to have biases and anger and people trying to right some wrongs and think they can tweak things. Is it the fact that, and I think Jeremy does write about this too, the fact that a lot of it is being led and pushed by whites?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely go to the liberal white woman and the,
you did.
and the white guilt. And I think this is what's bringing.
Everybody stop that. Everybody talks about this white. What are they guilty for? What are they guilty of? What do they feel? Why do they feel guilty?
I mean, they feel guilty. Well, let's go to George Floyd, right? Or let's go to, them exacerbating, the problems, that they feel are a direct result of, their skin colored, efforts towards the Black community, so it invokes this white guilt. It's mostly white women because men do not fall into it. And then what you have is especially the younger generation, you have a bunch of young, angry white males that are then going to swing the opposite direction, and I think I did hear one interview where you did say you wrote this book, for the base. You wrote it for white people to tell them, knock it off. You can be proud, just, knock it off. And I think that is a little, a simplistic of a statement because what we're seeing now is, again, we're seeing the opposite pendulum where, there's this whole generation of white males that are very angry. And I don't know how we reel that back in.
I think that's a totally fair point. About the angry young white males. I mean, I see a lot of them, right? And some of them will actually go after me because I'm too much of a civic nationalist, right? Or something like that. Or, some other problem that I have, they want me to be much more radical. So I definitely see that. And I agree that the counter reaction here is a danger. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this, is so that we can kind of have I think that better discussion. And it's got to be, I mean, one of the things, again, I mentioned in the book is it can't just be like, well, I wrote this book and all white people agree, so now we're great. There has to be some level of basic agreement about kind of where we are and how we go forward among people of every background. I mean, that's something I was very explicit with. If we're going to get the kind of American project back on course. And I think it's veered off course to a very significant degree, unfortunately.
You know, Jeremy, I want to ask you that question again that I asked Christy, because maybe your whiteness can bring some insight, because it's a really, important thing. Because I don't think I'm sitting here doing this podcast but for them, right? Because I was just a regular guy minding my own business. I didn't really care about this. What bothered me after George Floyd was people are going to have a visceral reaction, and that was fine. But it was just the very simplistic, naive, and frankly racist. You want to talk about anti-Black racism? When I watched, you all remember this. You remember when the celebrities did the soft music and the black and white, and they're like, "I take responsibility." Right. And you had Natalie Portman, those people, "I take responsibility." And they'll say such and such and thing. And then Julianne Moore gets on there and said that Black people are just being gunned down in the streets. And so I'm listening to all these reactions, and I know some of it's emotional. Some people, it comes from whatever. And you can say what you want about policing. This is not even a Black Lives Matter thing. If you think policing is not fair and you want to fix it, that's fine. But when you go as far as assuming that Black life is equal to, interactions with the police, poverty, and being undereducated, when yes, the poverty rate in the Black community is double that in the white community, but you're talking 8 and 16, not 24 and 48, right? So that makes 84% of Blacks don't live in poverty, but you're talking like that is just, but well, you know what you have to deal with every day. It was like nobody's really a very small percentage of Blacks are dealing with that every day. Yet the white people have taken it. And beyond that, you add a layer to that. It's not only that they're, increasing creating a false level of the problem, although there's a problem, but they're magnifying it well beyond where it really is. And then they're going far enough to say, and the only way to fix it is my whiteness. Isn't that the definition of racism?
Well, it is. And I mean, I even had members, not of my nuclear family, but my extended family, who kind of engaged in this sort of racial self-flagellation. And it was just really embarrassing. I couldn't even talk to them about it. I didn't even know where to begin to have that conversation. And I actually do think, and it's something I say in the book, I mean, I don't dwell on it, but I say, I mean, the biggest villains to me here are liberal whites. And in doing that, I kind of say a couple things. One, I've been convinced, especially in the result of doing this, and talking about it a lot, this is so much true that my next book is going to be about liberal whites. And basically how they're, I think, the kind of most toxic group in America for a variety of reasons. But having said that, I think there can also be a little bit of cuteness or apologeticness that kind of denies minority political leadership agency to say, oh, it's just those bad liberal whites over there. And no, I mean, I think there's been a lot of bad actors among the leadership of non-white political communities who have contributed, but and quite a lot. But I think at some level, I can also kind of understand that. I mean, it's, people have a natural ethnocentrism and they have a natural tendency to advocate for their group. Whereas liberal whites, it's insane. And so, and they're very powerful, and they run the media, they run a lot of other institutions. And so, I mean, I think they are the real problem, even though I don't want to kind of remove agency from everybody else and say, oh, it's just those bad people over there. It's not you. Couldn't be you. You're perfect. You're great. I love you. But I do think that they really are a big problem, and somebody really needs to kind of sit them down on the couch and psychoanalyze what's going on there.
Right.
I'll give you the perfect example. Springfield, Ohio, the poor little boy that was killed when the Haitian ran into the bus. The father stood up and said, I wish my son would have been killed by a 60-year-old white man instead of a Haitian.
Right. Yeah. It's incredible.
WTF. What the?
But what is that? I mean,
I
saw a lot
wonder,
of comment on that.
Is that the Civil Rights Division of DOJ has an entire, it's called Community Relations Division or something. Well, maybe you might know the name, but they basically descend on these sorts of situations when they happen and provide the talking points to sort of shell-shocked victims. I'm not saying that's what happened here. I mean, I think the fact that they were still weeks later kind of in front of the microphone saying that maybe it's genuine in this case. But we have our government, putting these types of words in people's mouths, and so it is just sort of crazy.
I think the thing so there are two things about the white left that I think lead people to make so much fun of it. Like the Chinese have a term, Baizhuo, which means like self-hating white liberal. And there's no equivalent for like hip hop black guy who's a little woke. I think there are two components. Like one is that a lot of these people are further to the left than almost anyone in minority communities. And they really are.
Sure.
Like if you look at black Americans, Hispanics, they're white ethnic groups, Italians, all those aren't minorities. They tend to be like conservative Democrats, sort of. Like there are 20% of black men are probably going to vote for Trump, but most are going to vote Democratic and bitch about the party. They're guys you see at town meetings, the local coaches. But there's a big difference between that and like the purple-haired radical woman with proud slut tattooed on her forehead who's leading a protest in Bowdoin. So I think people do notice that and they're like, what the hell's wrong with these people? Like, how much do they dislike their fathers? It's something that you might hear in a group chat. But I think part two also just people tend to dislike and have contempt for other people that are prey. Like, if you put aside contemporary Christian morality, which we all accept from time to time, but you think about rational amorality or older Viking morality or something, you'd have total contempt for someone that came up to you and said, hey, can I be your slave? I probably wouldn't even allow a person like that around me because I would view it as sort of corrupting. You need to have aggression and pride and so on. I think when people see this stuff, like there are all these people kneeling to George Floyd who, I don't think that was great policing, but was a scumbag criminal. Like the gold casket drawn by Coach and Four, like an Elizabethan king. There's a reaction of sort of disgust that a lot of minority lords, like leaders in that community, are willing to exploit. Like, I've talked to Ben Crump in passing online. He's a funny guy. He's a good lawyer. He knows he's just taking your money, not yours. But I mean, those guys are willing to take that. And, other people in the mostly Caucasian community are willing to follow that. But I think for the average tax-paying citizen, again, you can look at Crump and say, okay, that's an enemy. That's an opponent. But no one really hates him. There's not contempt for him. When you see the people crying on the George Floyd casket, ripping their shirts open like Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, there is a question of what the hell is wrong with these people. And I think that plays into that.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah.
We've been
absolutely. And I think there's, go ahead.
No, go ahead. If you got something to add, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that there's interesting studies and I'd love to see it replicated a couple more times before I declared it to be a fact, even though it definitely reconfirms my priors about how when conservative whites talk to minorities, they tend to talk like they use vocabulary at a sort of peer-to-peer level, whereas liberal whites, they're like immediately are talking down, right?
Yeah.
And I saw this really visibly. I grew up in North Carolina around a pretty significant sized African-American community, and I was very comfortable in that. And then I got I wasn't a super conservative guy growing up, but I wasn't woke for sure. And then I got to Yale where as an undergrad, where everybody was like super, super politically correct about things, but they were actually really visibly uncomfortable, a lot of these white guys, around like a real African-American person. You could like just see it, right? Like they didn't know how to behave. They're worried they're going to make a wrong step. And that was like kind of a first sort of aha moment for me, because it was the first time I'd been in a new environment, different than the one when you grow up, you just sort of take things at face value, right? Like, okay, this is the community I live in, and this is, how people think about it. So,
wait a minute, Jeremy. You went to Yale for undergrad. They had regular African Americans there?
I did.
Because I thought they only had immigrants at the Ivies.
Well,
some Nigerian prince pretending to be oppressed.
I'm dating myself a little bit, right? This was actually before.
I'm just saying.
It was all
I'm happy to hear
American descendants of slaves.
Wow, a black person. I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was different. I mean, and of course, at that time, this is early 90s that I went there. Right. I think, most of the African Americans there, not all, but most were sort of from more privileged socioeconomic backgrounds. But even it was,
the Obamas
for these people who went to Choate. Yeah, right. For people who went to Choate or for people who went to Exeter or, whatever, this was just a different world, right? They didn't have any background for dealing with that. By the way, that was actually true for me, I guess, to a lesser extent, in that I'd never grown up around any minorities other than African Americans. Like, I remember distinctly the first time I heard an Asian American over about 45 years old who spoke without an accent, I was in college. So, it was just a less diverse community than it is a less diverse America than it is today. So I'm not casting aspersions there, or maybe I am, but I'm just more making a social observation.
Right. What I wanted to say, what I was going to say then was that that was just an aside, but wanted to say that we've been mostly agreeing, and I think it's because we agree on the majority of what you write about in your point. And there's another thing I want to bring up later, but I want to point out a couple of things. I know Christy mentioned something for her that I either disagree with or more like took issue with, or maybe needed more context to the way it was written. But there's
Sure.
one would be where early on in the book you're writing about I guess, kind of expressing the advantages of and the contributions of a white majority culture and what happens as the country changed, right? But isn't a lot of that really more a change from being unified, right? Because you were right that in a period, not only was it mostly white, it was mostly English, or it was mostly, very similar beyond just this skin color, right? It was, and then as things changed and evolved, but immigration was so different then, it was harder to do it. And the people who came here came with a purpose. So you were able to hold on to the ideals and the culture of the country. So it's not so much white, I guess I'm saying, or I'm asking if you believe this, that it's not so much white as it is being able to maintain that culture. Because I'm assuming today you would much rather have immigrants or Black or Chinese or whatever people that believe in Western values and believe in, the old traditions of America than you would to have a bunch of those purple-haired white people that Will was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've talked about this in the context. I mean, well, I think we probably need basically an immigration moratorium right now, but that's a side note. But assuming that we did, I think Wilfred's eyes got a little bit bigger when I said that. But what I've used is the phrase colorblind, but not culture blind. And I think that kind of gets at what you're talking about in terms of how I think about this, right? And that is to even just at a trivial level, right? Like a highly educated Igbo Nigerian does not equal a Somalian, or like the base level, Somalian immigrant we're getting in Minneapolis, right? So those are very different cultural backgrounds with very different chances of kind of fitting in well in the United States, right? And I think you could do that up and down the line.
Right. Will, I got one other one, but I want to hear what you have to say as well.
Okay. I mean,
yeah, if you had anything you wanted to add.
Oh yeah, not a very lengthy comment on that, but yeah, I think that most of us to some extent have a business background. We talked about it on the show. I think that political correctness in government and academia, in addition to being stupid logically and morally, really impedes like practical solutions to things. So with immigration, I mean, you can literally go on Wikipedia or Britannica and see the earnings per household for each income group in the country, and you can break that down by immigrant and native. I mean, I think we've probably all done this in online debates. It takes 15 seconds. So it seems like you would want to let in more people from groups that succeed in your country. And interestingly, a lot of those groups would be Black, Nigerians, Ghanaians, so on. Others, Haitians, unfortunately, Somalis, would receive a smaller share of the immigration pie. But the idea that you can't discuss that is bizarre. Like the focus of an immigration policy should be on benefiting the people that live in your damn country. It's one of the simplest rules that you could ever possibly come up with. So I guess that's just my comment on that. I do have a question down the road about this idea of multiracial whiteness, by the way, since we're talking about Japanese, Nigerian people and so on. Right. But that's probably going to be after your question, Charles.
Okay, let's do that later. I was going to say something, but but based on what Will said, it made me think. That's the other thing. And I think you're right about it a bit, but we always talk about that nonsense of the stupid diversity as our strength stuff. And obviously it's silly, but even if you wanted to give them a little grace, Will gives me a hard time, but I'm always like, well, let's give them their argument. If they meant something that made more sense about it, I can kind of buy it. So here's two ways, a difference that you can look at that term. The way they mean it, which is really bad, or like, which we all know, we could talk about. But did you see the picture? I think Will use a different example, like a science example. But we had the Olympics this year, and I saw a story, this kind of like ancillary. It wasn't big on the news. It's kind of popped up saying that the U.S. finally medaled in ping pong. Like never medaled in ping pong. The U.S. is fight USA, and of course, everyone on the team, was an Asian American citizen,
Chinese
right?
American, to be
So
sure.
that's
Yeah,
the way
they were all
you know,
specifically Chinese and from like the Chinese coast where they played ping pong. Like it's really
literally,
funny.
right?
And on
Literally,
Chinese sites, they were talking about that.
right?
Yeah.
Like literally played for China 4 years ago. No, so that is the way you could say, see, diversity is good. But that's not what they mean, right? We know when they say it's the strength, they mean it's stronger if we had a black and a left-handed lesbian and a dwarf with this, and then we had this person and an atheist. They want to mix people in a pot, regardless of their ability or anything else, and just think that's going to magically work, which is insane, and it won't work. But you know, it's kind of like that. That's what made what Will's comment made me think of.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And one of the issues I think that we have right now, and one of the reasons why I think we need this immigration moratorium is just to reconstitute, like any nation, we need to tell a story about ourselves that kind of involves all of us to some degree. Now, I think we've already made this very challenging, but it can be done. And what you basically saw, you have in 1924, the strictest immigration law that's passed. And so you have a huge kind of deficit of immigration over the next several decades. It's not a coincidence that in that period of time, a bunch of white ethnics who saw themselves often as quite different sort of, you know, we kind of get into this Ozzie and Harriet world, whether or not that was the actual reality, but at least that was the story that we were telling ourselves at that point. And now it's really difficult for me to see what is the unified story that we're telling ourselves. In some ways, actually, that is an easier conversation, even though it's very fraught for descendants of slaves and white Americans, because at least we do have this common history with all of its, you know, ups and downs that everybody's clearly American, right? And part of that story. Where I think it's difficult is we're now just bringing in people from everywhere, and a lot of them don't have that historical context or you know, connection to the United States. And so to make them part of a unified American story, I just think it's just challenging.
I think that's a great time to ask you a question about the white identity, Will.
Okay, so my question, one of the things that I found interesting looking through this book is that although it'll obviously be called that, because even I'm called a Nazi pretty regularly, this actually isn't an alt-right book in any real sense. So when you think of dissident right, you're thinking of sort of ethno-state enjoyers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've always found, I've debated a few of them. Some of them have solid arguments in a theoretical vacuum. But I mean, the USA has never been an ethno state. We have 91 white ethnic groups in the country, Irishmen, Italians, people with these great proud traditions that used to fight each other in public brawls. And now, of course, we have Hispanics, blacks, anyway. But so your comment is we actually aren't going to be an ethno state. You make both those points, and then you say, but what we need to do, you could call it multiracial whiteness or
that's a sort of provocative
that people are going to move. Right.
Yeah. How do you, so, I mean, I already know the answer to the first part. I mean, you seem to be thinking of a multi-ethnic, but one cultural U.S. identity. How do you see yourself getting there? What's the plan there?
Well, it's really hard. In many ways, you know, my cheap punt on that question is to say I'm mostly trying to identify a problem here. And I do, of course, offer solutions, but I'm not, you know, if it's a little bit like the problems that get on a president's desk. You know, if it were an easy problem, it would have been solved by somebody before it got to the president. So, you know, if this were an easy problem, I wouldn't have had to write a book about it. I do think, you know, I'm glad you did note this is obviously not an alt-right or adjacent book, and that was very intentional. And in fact, and I don't mean this to, I mean, everybody obviously basses them from ethnic perspective, but I'm not trying to, or from a ethics perspective, but I'm actually not trying to do that there. I'm just going to treat their ideas as their ideas. And I think that they, like everybody else, have a right to them. But where I've been critical, and again, in the book, I'm quite explicit about this, is they do a lot of hand waving. You know, they sort of have this vision of like white America, and they, well, that's interesting. Well, how do you get there? And then they kind of clam up, right? Because they don't really want it. So I just take the fact we are a multi-ethnic state. That is just a fact. You know, whether I would have done immigration policy in the same way or 15 other policies, that's irrelevant, right? It's just we are where we are today in 2024, and we've got to operate going forward on that basis, right? So that's just my assumption. And I mean, how do we get to this place? I mean, I think the best thing I could say is we have to stop the racial scapegoating of each other, period, right? That is the best first step, that we are telling a basically positive story. By the way, truth can be sacrificed to a degree in telling positive stories about each other. That's okay. It's okay for nations to have myths about each other. In fact, I would argue that's almost the function. National mythos, you saw this a little bit in this recent debate on World War II with Tucker. I mean, I think national mythos is a very important thing, and I don't think that we necessarily want to discourage that. So I just like us to be telling a set of better stories about ourselves. And I think we used to, not even that long ago. I mean, I grew up, you mentioned, I think earlier, Charles, the Huxtables. I mean, I grew up in that era watching the Cosby Show, right? And, was that like the reality of the modal Black family in 1980?
Every Black person I knew,
was,
Jeremy, every Black family I knew.
but it was a good story for us to be telling as Americans, for everybody, and everybody got behind it. Right. And I grew up in this world in which, it was like Bill Cosby and Eddie Murphy and Michael Jordan and, all these things. And I'm not just kind of the grumpy old guy. We were just in the 80s and 90s. We were a much more unified country along these lines. Right. Not that everything was perfect by any stretch, but the kind of toxicity that is a regular feature of the discourse today, maybe it was there, but I didn't see a lot of it.
I actually can I jump in, Charles?
Yes.
I actually 100% agree.
At me from India. Of course you can jump in.
When you see, now you are going to get it as that being racist.
Right, that's where they are. You call the call center. They say, "Hey, this is Karen from Cleveland." You're like, "Karen, where are you?"
He's trying to get us in trouble.
I'm sorry.
When you talked about the civic nationality, I totally agree with that. Also, I would love if we just shut the border for a little while and just took a pause on everything. Go. Now, you know who did have a solution, or who had at least had a set of possible solutions, was Vivek. Vivek had where, let's bind us together. Let's give us something to actually root for. Let's define who we are. Let's teach our children, right, to be proud of this country and our history. Yeah. I think that would go a long way. And I think that kind of goes to what, you were speaking of, because definitely I grew up in a very white or Black area. I grew up in Ohio for the first 13 years of my life. Yeah. And in Ohio, there were no Hispanics. There were very few Asians. So it was very white or Black. So I think when we start becoming the melting pot, what does it mean to be the melting pot, and how do we assimilate all of these different, cultures together? I don't think America has ever really wrestled with that.
Well, Christy, you're talking about Vivek. You should probably call your homie and tell him to come on the show. But Jeremy, to that, you do say, I forgot the term. I didn't write it down. Remember it. You do say not a full solution, but when you talk about what happened, I can see how people would twist it. You did say part of that will be the whitening of America, in that more people obviously are becoming mixed, which is a pretty interesting thing. So that happens, and everybody's talking about that. They say the white racists hate it. They say, oh, it's gonna crowd out the whites. Well, you had an interesting thing. You say, well, what happens because they're half white, if they start identifying as white?
Right. No, I mean, and there's a scholar, Eric Kaufman, in the UK, and I think some of you, Wilfred, you probably know him, and I think he does really good work. He actually wrote a very nice review, very kind review of my book, which, as an academic, even if he's a little heterodox, was a bold thing to do, and I appreciated. But he talks a lot, and he's personally an example of this. I mean, he's partially Asian, he's partially Puerto Rican, and but he kind of modally, even to a significant degree, he kind of looks white, but I think he identifies with that majority culture. We don't need to call that white, by the way. In fact, I would argue probably, long term, it doesn't really serve our interests to focus on that. It should just be an American culture, right? But we need to be moving toward that. And I think the Hispanic community, this is one kind of interesting thing where, we've created a bunch of incentives since 1980 for them to identify in this very, to kind of use a leftist term, to minoritize themselves. But overall, while the Hispanic community is obviously very diverse, this is overall a European community that has a lot of common history with at least some parts of the US. And, we could definitely sort of bring them into this kind of multi-ethnic but American tent. And in fact, in some ways, that's kind of already happening. I think you're seeing a lot of this Trump support among Hispanics is like third generation English speaking, and they're kind of like these white guys, right? I mean, they're sort of pissed off. They don't like the political correctness. And so you're seeing these sorts of movements. And so I actually do think there's hope. I mean, if I didn't think there's hope, I wouldn't have written the book. But unfortunately, The Democrats are kind of trying to strangle that hope in the crib, because I think it really serves their interests to sort of pit everybody against each other and carve out as many different identity categories as they can to distribute various types of benefits to.
Well, first of all, Jeremy, that was disrespectful to Democrats because they would never let a baby make it to a crib.
Yeah,
and then beyond that,
I didn't say it. I mean, I thought it, but I didn't.
But I kid. But I have something that I was going to pivot, so I'll let Will say what he was about to say first.
No, just I mean, a lot of. So, I mean, I think that one thing that's actually kind of interesting there, I've long thought that demographic change is one of the more overrated issues in the country when people bring this up as a risk. So, like, historically, the conflict in the United States is sort of whites v. blacks. You had Native American Indians. Those groups are almost not represented in the changing population picture. I love blacks and whites, but that's not really what we're seeing. The increased black population is, again, coming from the ruling class in Nigeria, so on. They're assimilating well. The largest group I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that, African Americans and IQ's gone up a couple points. A lot of things are happening. But I mean, but when you look at the groups that are actually migrating to the USA, you have Hispanics. And I mean, Jeremy's right. That's about a 66% majority Euro descent group. I'm not going to parse out like who's white and who's not in the 66%, but those are the people that consider themselves majority Spanish or whatnot that identify as white on the census. The next group is Asians at 7%, going to be 9% soon. They're kicking everybody's ass. Like they're fine. And that are intermarrying at a really high rate. And then the third group is people that are interracial, broadly defined. So like white and Mexican. So, I mean, when you actually look at the demographic shift in the country, it's not that the USA is 58% white and 42% black. And these two groups that have been fighting since, Mansa Musa or have an issue here. It's that the USA is 58% non-Hispanic Caucasian, 17% Hispanic Caucasian, 10% half Caucasian. I don't see this as good or bad, but it's a situation that's very different from the way this is presented on the left and the right. Like a lot of these white people, a lot of these white people are basically saying, I'm not white for the reason that Jeremy and Charles gave, which is sort of, there's a social benefit in not doing so. Sure. Like Jews and Arabs now are a race. They're MENA. So I mean, they're no longer in the white category. There's an element of come on with this.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, back in the day, you can go back 100 plus years ago and there were very few Indian Americans at the time, but you have Indian Americans petitioning the Supreme Court to say, basically, bro, we're the original Caucasians. And the Supreme Court saying, yeah, actually, that's true, but not in our way. So like, you don't count anyway, right? Like that's what it was actually like to be in a white supremacist culture. Whereas now, of course, everybody wants to identify as anything other white. Native Americans, right? We've had a 10x explosion, as I document in the book, in Native American population since 1970. And this is not due to Native American fertility, but due to the fact that a bunch of people who don't look that much different than me have decided that it's pretty nice to be Native American these days. So there's preposterousness. And, again, and just to kind of, put a little white pill out there, I actually think, again, you were just touching on, who's immigrating here. We are very fortunate. And for as much as I complain, I do complain, and I'm not hiding the fact that I complain about, our open border. And I think that it's been really negative for not just a few years, but decades now. We're actually very fortunate in terms of the people that we have coming here as compared to Europe, and that I think they are, for a million different reasons, much more assimilable if we choose to do the right things here into a majority culture. They also tend to be better educated, just more functional around a variety of different things. You take Hispanics, and again, they're the largest group, and they're part of the story of the Americas, at least going back hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas a Saudi showing up in the UK or a Pakistani even, it's just not quite the same story for them. So I actually think we've got, compared to a lot of other places, a very fortunate situation. I'm just trying to make sure we don't ruin that situation.
Yeah, your story about the explosion of Indians make me think of who's, I guess, I feel bad because her name escapes me, the physical anthropologist who had the book about the idiots.
Weiss. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth Weiss, she called them Faux, Faux, Pocahontas.
Yes.
Yeah, like you're
Yeah.
talking about like Elizabeth Warren levels of native quote unquote blood with a lot of people. Like
Yeah,
I'm
but there was
one.
like
I've
one college that had
Yeah.
80% Native American students. It's like there's not even that many in this state. And I don't worry
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they
Yeah.
you don't
Oh
want
no.
to say
I mean,
things like they
it
lost the
like,
war, but yeah, there aren't that many Indians in most small areas. Yeah,
Right.
that's
well,
wild.
and so I live in like one of the whitest states. The only significant minority we really have here in Montana is a significant Native American population, and it's very funny because I go to church with a few. You know, those guys are just like, you know, they look really Native in many cases, and they're like, you know, call me John and whatever. They're sort of, we're just bros, right? And then it's like the ones who look like Elizabeth Warren are like with the headdresses and,
Yeah.
you know, the whole getup, right? And it's like, you know, what are you compensating for here,
Yep,
right?
that's about what I'd expect. So
Did you guys see away from the topic, but did you guys see the woman who was like the lieutenant governor of Minnesota who's said
Ah,
on Twitter, like, my name is like Watuki Hapase Patu Ni, and I'm from the Throne Hatchet Patrol of the Spotted Wolf tribe of the whatever. And
yeah,
like someone looked her up, I think it was Elon Musk, and commented underneath, your name is Elizabeth Vasseur Brown. And it was just like, that's, you
yeah.
know, it is what it is.
Yeah,
that
but
is
that's, I
so
mean,
great.
you know, and this is really the point of my book, right? Is that we're incentivizing that behavior as a
Yep.
society.
Yep.
It's a choice that we're making, right? Just as it was a choice to kind of try to wipe out those cultures.
Right.
By the way, in many cases with, you know, it was progressives doing that in their mind, being progressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kill the Indian, they said, and save the man. That was the excuse for these residential schools. You know, that was a different choice that we were making. It was also not the right choice. Um, but you know, we could choose to in fact emphasize unity rather than you know, distributing all these points for how non-white you can be, right?
Now the conversation is going great, and I got a bunch of things I didn't even get to. I mean, you reference stuff from Will's book, that stuff about, and you do break down in the book the various areas where the anti-white racism as which is everywhere, but you take it apart so you can explain how it's affecting housing, immigration, the military, the church, entertainment. So you all should buy the book so you can reach all that. But I do want to end on this one. It's not really a negative note because it's not really mine, but I try to read it and think about how some people will take it depending on the audience.
Sure.
So I want to know, I know you had to think about this. Do you get this? And if so, what are your response to this? I think that some people would say that you're just bitching, that you sound, that you're using the same, and then sometimes you do the same language. You're using the same language as the anti-racist. You're no different than Kendi and
Right.
Robin DiAngelo with a different end. You're saying, woe is me. You're saying, look at what it's going to be in years. We'll be replaced. You're saying the country can't survive without us, and we need our white-parations. So what do you say to the person who says that about your book?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because this was something I spent a lot of time thinking about when I wrote the book. Because it was interesting. A couple women I talked to were like, you know, women hate whiners. You know, you just sound like a loser. Like you have to write the book in such a way. Like it was really helpful to me, right? Like don't be a beta, right? Like, and so I've tried to say whenever it's been asked, I am not, in fact, I even had this and I wish I'd kept it in. I took it out for, you know, one of those many editing things because I said this quite explicitly in the book. We don't need a new victim class in the United States. And I'm not suggesting
it
that
says they're the unprotected class right on the cover.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that white people sign up for that. I think the challenge, and it is a challenge, right, is like, how do I talk about what's really going on without just kind of saying like, woe is me, you know, let's be victims. What I'm instead trying to do is just accurately describe what I think is going on and say that, you know, we need to vindicate the same rights that everybody else has, that we're entitled to constitutionally because we're Americans, not because we should get special rights or not because, you know, gosh, being a white American today is just like being an African American, you know, in the early days of Jim Crow. I mean, no, it's not true, right? But it's, you know, so it is a challenge to talk about this without kind of being a whiny victim. So you know, all I can say is I've done my best, right? Like I'm not saying that I succeeded in every point. I really do just try to lay out the facts as I see them. I think one of the best thing that I did in the editing process is anytime anything got too emotional, we just took it out. Like it's there's a phrase in the law, I don't know if any of you are attorneys, res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. And that's really what I've tried to do here. But I'm definitely not trying to create a new victim class. I'm not trying to create even more, God forbid, racial set-asides for whites or anything like that. We just need to do away with all of that and focus on what we need to do to be united as we can, because I'm not naive to think that we're just going to be one perfectly happy American community, but we need to take the disparate strands that we've got now and unify as much as we can. And I think that starts with just, as John Roberts said, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, and not to get clever and try to do 15 other things.
Well, I just want to tell you one, like Christy was the only one that didn't write the controversial book. I'm the only one here who's not an attorney, so they both knew that term. And then, I wasn't accusing you of that, but I can see how reading it, I'm like, oh, this is what people are going to say.
Yeah.
But I will say some of the positive, obvious takeaways, to leave it on something more positive. In the Wilfred Riley vein of just tell the truth. It seems like if I could simplify your book to just a couple pages, you're saying, equality should be real, not the stuff that they talk about. And maybe we shouldn't, have homeless Americans on the street and pay people money to come here illegally. Maybe we shouldn't pay a guy, Jacob Blake, who got shot, treat a guy like Jacob Blake who got shot 9 times. Will tell you every time that comes up, I have to remind people he did not get shot 7 times. And treat him totally differently than Kyle Rittenhouse, and that we probably shouldn't give $1,000 to a guy for running over women. So you basically say, you just want to lessen that, not to give whites anything.
Correct. Absolutely. I could not have said that better. That is the goal of writing this book.
Well, that I can sign on to. Anything any parting words for you, Christy or Wilfred?
No, I mean, I thought it was great. I think, just when you first came in, you acknowledged, you kind of took the air out of any, tire that I had by saying at one point there was white supremacy. So I think just kind of understanding or having that little, thing where you acknowledge that, but we moved past that. And I think that did wonders for anything that may have kind of rubbed me a little the wrong way.
No, that's great. And that's good. That's good feedback. And I mean, it's really easy for me to say that because obviously it's true, right? Like I'm not trying to, no pun intended, whitewash the history of the US and pretend that it was all, candy and roses, right? But I think, again, the point is we move past that. And even to the degree that we haven't moved past things perfectly, the kind of endless racial tit for tat does not serve our interests, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of the basis on which, I wrote the book, and the basis on which I hope it's received. But I mean, if anybody's interested, again, the book's The Unprotected Class. You can get it on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. And I have a Substack, The Course of Empire, and you can check things out there, or I'm on X. I am not I don't have as many followers as Wilfred Riley, and I'm frankly not as good at X as he is either. But it's I am there and pretty active, and so that's good places if folks are interested.
What's your handle on X?
Real Jeremy Carl.
Well, since Jeremy just closed the show for me, so I don't get to. He already told you who he is and where to find him. I just will thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for coming on. It was a good conversation. We appreciate you, and have a good one.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.